If you were to ask just about any English teacher, what was the most important event in the history of English, at least as it's spoken in England, they would say 1066, the Norman invasion. 1066 is the year it happened, and the Norman invasion refers to the time that a Norman duke, who speaks French, invades England, kills the king, and becomes the new king of England. This is a really important event for the history of English, because it marks a very radical shift in the language that's spoken by the people of England. Generally, it takes about 1,000 years for a language to change so much that someone who spoke it at the beginning of those 1,000 years would not be able to understand the language spoken by someone at the end of the 1,000 years. But this invasion was different. This invasion caused the language to change really dramatically in a much shorter span of time. Let me show you what I mean. We generally divide English into 3 stages. The earliest stage is called Old English, or Anglo-Saxon, and it begins around, circa means around 400, which is the fall of the Roman Empire in England, and it lasts to circa, which means around, 1100. This was mostly a Germanic language because the tribes who invaded England after the fall of the Roman Empire were people who spoke Germanic languages. There was also a little bit of Celtic, which was the language spoken by the people of England before the Romans invaded, and of course a little bit of Latin. 2 examples of Old English would be the Exeter Riddles and Dream of the Rood. The next stage of English is called Middle English, and this runs from about circa 1100 to circa, 1500. This version of English has a lot of French vocabulary because the invader, the Norman invader, spoke French. And an example of Middle English would be the Canterbury Tales. Finally, we have Modern English, and that goes from about 1500 to now. And this difference is marked by what's called the Great Vowel Shift. And this was a change in the way that people said vowels. 2 examples would be the plays and poems of Shakespeare and the King James Bible. It's weird to think that those are modern English, but they are. We would call them early modern English technically, but we're not going to go too far into the weeds on that. So let me show you how different Old English is from Middle English. If you look on the left, you can see a relatively famous poem in Middle English. And you're going to look at that and say, Alexine, I don't understand what that says. But I think that if you read it and are a little bit creative about it, you could figure it out. The first 2 lines go something like, Ora Fader, that art in heaviness, hallowed be thee nama. And some of us might recognize that as the beginning of the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, that art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. So it's true that this doesn't exactly look like the English we recognize, but it is an English we can sort of mostly decode. But if you look on the right, the Old English, that really looks like a language where we are not going to really be able to make heads or tails of it. I mean, maybe that first word you could see kind of looks like the word father, but you can see that there are letters we don't even recognize. So this is a really huge change from Old English to Middle English, and the cause of this change is the Norman invasion. So who were the Normans? The Normans were Vikings originally. And the Vikings were a people who liked to sail around on ships and go to different places and take the gold and the jewels, and eventually they wanted to settle there. And that's because the places where they lived didn't have a lot of good farmland, and they had a lot of population growth. So eventually, in France, Charles the Simple, the King of France, decided to give the northernmost part of France to the Vikings to settle. And the Vikings were called the Northmen, not exactly, but sort of like the Northmen. And those 2 words became the Normans. And so they called that land Normandy. So when I say that later King William, the Duke William of Normandy invaded England, I'm really essentially saying that someone who was French invaded England. You can see that Charles the Simple gave this portion of France to the Vikings in 911 CE. And between that time and 1066, the Vikings settled in France, married French women, learned French, became essentially French, although they still had some cultural elements of the Viking culture that they came from. So here's the story of what happened. Edward the Confessor, well, he was called the Confessor about 100 years later, but King Edward, we'll call him, was married to a woman named Edith Godwin. And she was the daughter of the Earl of Godwin. And the Godwins were a very, very powerful family in England. He died with no children on January 5th, 1066. So why no children? First of all, Edith was about 20 years younger than him, and Edward had periodic conflicts with Edith's incredibly powerful family. Maybe, in fact, Edward didn't want to have children with Edith because he didn't want a child of the Godwin family to get access to the throne. There's also a theory that he made a vow of celibacy, so maybe that's why he didn't have a child. He did send Edith away to a nunnery for about a year, but her father kind of overpowered that, and she was able to come back. So it's not entirely clear what happened. But anyway, they had no children. And while in England it wasn't guaranteed that the son of the king would become king, it was usually that person would usually be the first in line, at least. And often also the king would say who he felt should be the next king upon his death. But in any case, either Edward didn't do this, or as you'll see, he probably did it more than once, which created a problem. So apparently on his deathbed, King Edward said to Harold Godwinson, who's actually Edith's brother, so Godwin, son of Godwin, he says to Harold Godwinson, I'm going to give England to you. You can be the king. So the day after King Edward dies, the people of England, or at least the ones who got to make the decisions, agreed that Harold would be an excellent king, and he was crowned. But meanwhile, Harold's brother, Tostig Godwinson, who had been kicked out of England for, more family drama, joined forces with Harald Hardrada, who was the king of Norway. And that was because Tostig Godwinson felt that actually, he should be the king of England. So he and Harald Hardrada invaded England, and Harold Godwinson marched to the north of England, where Tostig and Harold landed, and defeated them in a battle, and managed actually to kill both of them. So in the meantime, we've got William, the Duke of Normandy. So William claims that when he was a child and Edward was in Normandy hiding from the Vikings who were invading England, Edward had said to William, if I die childless, you can have England. And William also said that when Harold Godwinson was in Normandy with William, the Duke of Normandy, that Harold Godwinson had said to him, I agree that Edward has given you the throne upon Edward's death, and I will respect that decision. Now, the catch is that at the time, Harold Godwinson was being held captive by William, the Duke of Normandy, so we might say that that was a promise made under duress. But nonetheless, in William's opinion, he should be the king of England. So he gets up an army, and he invades England from the south. So poor Harold, right? He has fought his own brother and the king of Norway, managed to defeat them, and now he has to march from the northern part of England all the way down to the south with his tired out army and fight King William. And for a whole number of reasons, which I won't go into, but you can read up on it if you want, William is able to kill Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings, and thereby become the King of England. So William did a couple of things once he was King of England. First of all, it's not like the British people said, okay, that's fine. People rose up against this. But William was a very seasoned warrior, and knew what he was doing. So the first thing that he did was he killed the aristocracy. And by killing the elites or the aristocracy of England, he basically destroyed their system of government because it was a very top-down system of government. So if you kill the people at the top, the system sort of falls apart. And then some people fled to other places, but then William, he claimed that all of England belonged to him, but he installed his friends and his allies, his French-speaking allies, in different parts of England and said, these parts of England are yours to rule over as long as you owe me taxes and military service. And he reinforced, some people say instituted, maybe reinforced, a system called feudalism. And feudalism says that when someone has the land, they essentially own the people on the land. So if you live in a certain place, there would be someone who owned that place that you owed portions of your annual harvest to, and often also your military service to. And if you didn't like that person, you couldn't leave because that person essentially owned you. So this created a new top-down system where the English peasants had to work the land and were poor and exploited, and the profits of their labor went up the lines of hierarchy all the way up to King William. King William also instituted what's called the Domesday Book, and there's a picture of it on the right. And this is literally a list of everything in England. Every single pig, every single chicken, every single object of value, every single person. And he did this to make sure that he got his due, that he got his taxes, that he got his wealth from the land. He also got rid of all of the British or English members of the church and replaced them with French people. And because most people were Christian, they had to go to church and be guided or governed by French speakers. And in this way, French became the language of power. So William never learned English. And in fact, he mostly didn't really live in England, but he instituted this system of power and control. And the only way to speak to that system of power and control was to speak to it in French. So French words made their way into English. For our purposes, I want you to take home a couple of lessons. One is that right now, English is the language of power. The majority of people who learn a second language will choose English as their second language because they understand that speaking English gives you access to power. But this was not always true about English. And in fact, in England, for 300 years, French was the language of power. This also shows us that there are predictable forces that cause languages to change, that power, oppression, migration, exploitation will shape a language, but also resistance and celebration, which we'll learn about as well. So the last thing I want you to see is that English itself changes over time. There's no one moment when we can say, this is English, because it has been changing and it will continue to change. I hope this is helpful. Let me know if you have any questions.